and I welcome this opportunity to discuss this issue, to make some suggestions in relation to this issue with a view this Minister and this Government tackling this situation in a way in which we can see results. Over 100,000 households are on the social housing waiting list across the country. That accounts to at least 200,000 citizens. And that is, and make no mistake about it, whether we account for the difficulties that have existed in relation to the finance that have been available for you to tackle this crisis, but that now has to be acknowledged to be a crisis, and to be a crisis that is actually out of control. And I would contend, vehemently actually, that the Government has failed to put any flesh on its lofty 2011 housing strategy. Instead of that, we've had reheated old policy announcements and a failure to launch capital investment or help voluntary housing associations finance projects. And I would ask, for example, in relation to your announcement yesterday, how different is that to what was announced in the 2014 budget? How different is the announcement in relation to the sector that is left starved of funding, that being the disabled, the elderly and housing adaptable grant assistance? How is it that you can say to me, or can you confirm to me, in the instance of my county, in Offaly, where applicants are being told that their assessment will take 3 to 5 years, let alone await for approval? Can you tell me, without contradiction, without fear or favour, that any announcement you've made yesterday will make a blind bit of difference to those applicants? How can you account for, in this day and age, that a housing officer in my own county could say to me recently, we are not able to deal with the representations you are making in relation to the housing list in the county of Offaly, of which I have been given the privilege to represent in this House? And he said I could publicise that fact because he has neither the resources, the staff or the mechanisms outside of the strangulation that is engulfed in that sector to deal with those issues. There is a vicious combination of harsh social welfare cuts and escalating rents, not only in Dublin but in other parts of the country, that are driving more and more onto that social housing waiting list and increasing homelessness levels. The woefully slow pace of NAMA property transfers is testament to the failure of government to prioritise the issue and provide sufficient administrative and logistical support to voluntary housing associations and local authorities. And I would further contend, Minister, that your government's over-reliance on private property rentals and over-reliance on the likes of RAS schemes will blow up in your face very shortly. Because make no mistake about it, banks will call in the debt relating to much of those homes, to much of those second investment homes that are in private ownership at present. And when that blows up, God knows what the waiting list figures will reach. Now, I would say here this evening, rather than harping on, or this morning, on the inability and inefficiency of government in the way in which they've handled this issue, and a failure to bring forward a housing bill in 3 years to deal and make concrete proposals to think outside of the box and meet the sort of lofty aspirations that were in your strategy published on entering government, maybe then we could see light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe then we could see a distinctive mechanism and roadmap to deal with the issues. So I want to use my time in making concrete proposals that I would expect you to take note of, that I would expect you to respond to, and I would expect you to have within any such housing bill that you say, or that I am promised over the last number of months, that is imminent and that will be before the House this session. In relation to NAMA transfers, I would ask that each local authority have a specific task force entrusted with accelerating the transfer of NAMA property units into social housing provision. The current delays have reduced the social dividend of the body and compounded the problems, as I said earlier, on waiting lists. And any such team based in the Housing Department could be charged with identifying the units, facilitating housing associations with those units, coordinating the legal work on the transfers and ensuring the follow-through on the necessary upgrading and investment. And another example of the deficiencies in the inefficient manner in which this situation is being led and delivered. Again, in Tullamore, for example, I know, and your department will be well aware of having identified a number of units within a housing development that the local authority may be interested in acquiring. And side by side with that ambition is the failure by the Department of the Environment and the bondholder to adequately, having agreed a mechanism, having agreed a plan to address the unfinished nature of the estate, have gone to ground in relation to a framework, have gone to ground in relation to a detailed plan in which the funds can be put to use to make the estate livable for many of them that are in it at present, let alone be in a situation whereby the local authority could take up on their wish to acquire units within that estate. And your department are well aware, and I was talking to some member in your department recently with this specific issue, and I will remind you of that. And I know you have said that there's a fund put in place, but this is a situation whereby a bond is in place. The bond is there and available. But there has been the local authorities have doing their damnness and doing their utmost and have got no response in a sufficient manner. And I put the question to the Minister for Finance some weeks ago because of his role as part of the interest of the taxpayer in relation to acquiring bonds for the use of local authorities to finish out estates. And an official within your department has been charged with responsibility of making sure that is done, and it's not the fault of the local authority in question, but it is much the fault of the bondholder, which is a reputable bank of which we have a large percentage of ownership of. But you have an official within your department whose job it is to liaise between the two, and as far as I'm concerned, is not doing their job adequately. I again would ask that a tenant purchase scheme be put in place, not only for local authorities, but for voluntary housing associations. And that should be provided to empower people to achieve home ownership. And the proceeds of these sales should be ring-fenced for future investment into the construction of new housing units. The issue of vacant homes is one we can all identify with. There are homes lying idle in the ownership of local authorities throughout this country, and much too many of them. And local authorities are starved of funds in order to address this issue. I would say that the local authority should allow families on waiting lists, with your direction and with your leadership, to move into these homes and refurbish them. And the cost of refurbishment should be gradually defrayed over time through reduced rents. And that will open up greater level of units to tackle the waiting list, which simultaneously reduce the upfront costs to local authorities. In the area of development plans should adhere to a hierarchy of plans to facilitate the construction of homes where sustainable demand rather than speculative construction. So there's a strong role in the creation of long-term housing policy. Density issues also have to be addressed to stimulate greater levels of construction and keep prices accessible for ordinary households. Housing construction should adhere to sustainable planning guidelines. Onerous unit density criteria is having a prohibitive impact on construction levels and stoking up prices to the exclusion of low and middle income earners. In the area of development levies, 50% of development levies currently is spent on water supplies. And this supply will now be subject to changes by virtue of Irish Water's, your government setting up Irish Water, because of the new water regime, forming a type of double charge on the homeowner if it's left as it presently stands with the development levy contained in addition to the water charges. So you need to review development levies across all local authorities, and you need to reassess what development levies should be, and based on that re-evaluation of costs following the removal of water provision from local authorities. Issues at Priory Hall and many other Priory Halls around the country obviously underlined a pressing need to protect homeowners from rogue developers. And we welcome the new building regulations insofar as they address issues of multiple units rather than the deficiencies which have been stated by many not to account for the one-off homes. But there should also be, and I would ask you to consider, a national database of rogue developers who fail to meet their planning permission criteria, and that be established. And that database should be used to inform planning permission decisions into the future, and the level of bonds required by any such local authority whom have access to it. Irrespective of what went before, Minister, you have a responsibility to this Dáil, to the members of this Dáil, to bring forward policy, to bring forward suggestions, whether it be in the form of a bill or otherwise, or legislation, to address the deficiencies that exist today, not yesterday, not last month, or not last year. And I, as well as many others, are fed up listening to the old mantra, to press the play on the machine you have in front of you to say, oh, it's all your fault and what we inherited and what we didn't and what we did not. You had a lofty policy document on entering government in relation to a housing strategy. Well, it's time to put flesh on the bones. It's not time to rehash the arguments we had before the last election. You won the election, and more luck to you. More luck to you. And the best of luck in the ones ahead of you. But I'll tell you, you'll be adjudicated on your deficiencies in order when you put no flesh on any bones that you had in your policies before now. And I'm here making honest, credible suggestions. Exactly, because that's my job and that's my role. And it's your role to listen to them, evaluate them, and come forward with concrete proposals thereafter, as you have been afforded that responsibility by the Taoiseach of Ireland. And please do that, and don't get into the wham-bam across the floor to me and what went before me and what was done and what wasn't done. You have a responsibility, live up to it.
To avoid confrontation between speakers in the House.
I'll avoid confrontation from the person opposite when she when she doesn't want to interrupt me. And as she said to herself, I am making some reasonable suggestions, and I would hope they'd be taken on board, and I look forward to the housing bill. It's 3 years in the making, but I would hope that you might consider some of the suggestions that I and others will make during the course of this debate, so as you have a meaningful manner in which this issue and this crisis, this ridiculous crisis, might be addressed. The last proposal I want to make is in the area of apprentice labour models. The dramatic decrease in construction activity has decimated apprenticeship numbers, as we know, throughout the country. Skilled labour is obviously vital to the future of the construction industry and a reliable employment source for young people across the country. The increase, or any increase in construction levels at local authority and housing association levels should, I believe, be coordinated with solace in order to maximise training and upskilling of apprentices. So it can have a double benefit to the economy. It can have a benefit to young people who want to engage in that industry. And we've seen recently, with the announcement of the CEO applications, you might have noticed this earlier this week, and the analysis of the various courses for which the youth made applications, and the not so young, as we know now, by virtue of the lifelong learning that we have encouraged and we welcome. But there has been an upturn in applications for the construction sector. And you have a responsibility insofar as you can encourage housing and construction development within the department and the role that you have. And I am asking you now to consider, as in the case of other suggestions, but will you consider discussing with and formulating with Solace in the event of construction flowing from your bill that might be published in the coming months, that you will work with Solace with a view to allowing for the maximising of training and upskilling of apprentices. That I think is a formative sort of suggestion to make. And I regret, Cathaoirleach, that I've been forced to raise my voice in relation to some of the suggestions that I wanted to make. And I think, you know, I entered this debate in the manner in which I expect the Minister brought forward the time allocated for equitable, honest efforts on the part of those of us on this side of the House to play our role in addressing what is a crisis. And make no mistake about it, when a housing officer in your own county says to you, I can no longer deal with the level of representations I'm receiving from you because I don't have the resources, the time or the mechanisms available to me to adequately deal with the spiralling out of control list that exists. And I know that is replicated in many parts of the country. Particularly many of my colleagues in Dublin and Cork and other cities will tell you, because of the housing, the rental prices spiralling as they are, that this crisis in relation to waiting lists is also out of control. But I want to remind the Minister on this final point, and that is, irrespective of whom is in or was in government, we have allowed a situation to evolve whereby there's an over-dependency on the private rental sector. We have allowed a situation to become where we've become over-dependent in each local authority on schemes such as the RAS scheme. And I am saying to you now, in addition to what Mr Kelly said last week, and you can be sure, as sure as night follows day, that banks are going to start calling in those loans. And in order for them to call in part of those loans, they're going to have to call in the properties associated with them. Many of those properties contain people who are on waiting lists. And there has to be a concerted effort. And I want to implore upon you to honour the commitment made by yourself, your line minister and the Taoiseach in recent months, that you will bring forward a housing bill in addition to the funds that you have announced yesterday and in the 2014 budget, that you have to come forward with a whole-of-government approach to this issue in order to address what is a huge crisis.